The desert sun beat down mercilessly on the wagon train as it crawled across the New Mexico territory in the summer of 1863. Sarah Mitchell clutched her swollen belly, feeling another sharp pain shoot through her body. She was 9 months pregnant, and the journey west had taken its toll on her fragile frame. Her husband, Thomas, rode alongside the wagon, his eyes constantly scanning the horizon for any signs of danger. The Apache raids had been increasing in frequency, and every settler knew the risks they were taking by crossing this unforgiving land. Sarah had been reluctant to make this journey. Back in Missouri, she had a comfortable home, friends, and a midwife she trusted. But Thomas had been convinced that California offered them a better future, a chance to claim land and build something meaningful. Against her better judgment, Sarah had agreed, not knowing that this decision would change her life forever in ways she could never have imagined. The wagon train consisted of 15 families, all heading west with dreams of prosperity. Sarah had become close with a few of the women during the long months of travel. Martha Henderson, a sturdy woman with 3 children of her own, had promised to help Sarah when her time came. But as the pains grew stronger that afternoon, Sarah realized that the baby would not wait for a convenient moment or a safe location. Thomas called for the wagon master to stop the train. The other families gathered around as Martha and 2 other women helped Sarah into the back of the wagon. The canvas covering provided little privacy, but there was no other option. Sarah gritted her teeth as the contractions intensified, trying to be brave for Thomas, who paced nervously outside. The desert heat made everything worse, and Sarah found herself drifting in and out of consciousness as the labor progressed. Hours passed, and the sun began its descent toward the western horizon. The baby finally arrived just as darkness fell, a tiny girl with a surprisingly strong cry. Martha wrapped the infant in a clean cloth and placed her in Sarah's exhausted arms. For a brief moment, Sarah forgot about the pain, the heat, and the dangerous journey. She looked down at her daughter's face and felt a surge of love so powerful it brought tears to her eyes. But the relief was short-lived. Sarah began to hemorrhage badly, the blood soaking through the blankets beneath her. Martha's face grew pale as she tried to stop the bleeding, but nothing worked. The other women looked at each other with worried expressions, knowing that without proper medical care, Sarah's chances of survival were slim. Thomas was called into the wagon, and when he saw his wife's condition, his face crumbled with fear and desperation. The wagon master made a difficult decision. They could not stay in this location overnight. Apache scouts had been spotted in the area, and remaining stationary made them vulnerable to attack. The train would have to keep moving even though Sarah desperately needed rest. As gently as possible, they arranged blankets around her to cushion the rough ride. The baby was tucked into a basket, still crying lustily, unaware of the danger surrounding them. As night fell completely, the wagon train pressed forward under the pale light of a half-moon. Sarah drifted in and out of consciousness, her body growing weaker with each passing hour. She could hear the baby crying somewhere nearby, but she lacked the strength to reach for her daughter. Martha stayed by her side, offering sips of water and words of comfort, though both women knew the situation was dire. Then, just before midnight, the attack came. The sound of war cries pierced the darkness, followed by the thunder of hoofbeats. Apache warriors descended on the wagon train from all sides, their faces painted for battle. Thomas grabbed his rifle and joined the other men in defending the train, but they were outnumbered and surrounded. The fighting was fierce and chaotic, with gunshots echoing across the desert and women screaming in terror. In the confusion, Sarah's wagon was cut off from the others. She could hear Thomas shouting her name, but his voice grew fainter as the warriors drove the defenders back. Martha tried to protect both Sarah and the baby, but there was little she could do against armed warriors. Rough hands pulled them from the wagon, and Sarah felt herself being lifted onto a horse too weak to resist. The last thing she saw before losing consciousness was Martha being dragged away in another direction. The baby's basket clutched in another warrior's arms. When Sarah awoke, she found herself lying on the ground near a small fire. Her body ached all over, and she felt as though she had been beaten. As her eyes adjusted to the firelight, she saw that she was in an Apache camp. Several warriors sat around nearby fires, talking in their own language. Her hands had been bound with leather strips, and a woman was tending to her wounds with an expression of detachment. Sarah's first thought was of her baby. She tried to sit up, panic flooding through her weakened body. Where was her daughter? Was she alive? The Apache woman pushed her back down firmly, speaking words Sarah could not understand. Tears streamed down Sarah's face as she realized the full horror of her situation. She had been captured, separated from her husband and child, and was now a prisoner of the people she had been taught to fear. The days that followed were a blur of pain and despair. Sarah's body slowly began to heal from the childbirth, but her spirit was crushed. She was kept separate from the other captives, guarded closely by the Apache women. They gave her food and water, treated her wounds, but offered no kindness or explanation. Sarah learned that several people from the wagon train had been killed in the attack, while others had been taken captive like herself, but she heard no news of her baby or Thomas. As weeks passed, Sarah was forced to work alongside the Apache women, gathering firewood, preparing food, and tanning hides. The work was hard and unfamiliar, and she was punished harshly whenever she failed to complete a task properly. Her hands became raw and blistered, her back ached from carrying heavy loads, and her heart remained broken from the loss of her child. Each night she lay on the hard ground and wept silently, wondering if she would ever see her daughter again. The Apache moved their camp frequently, traveling through the mountains and deserts with practiced ease. Sarah was tied to a horse during these journeys, treated like cargo rather than a human being. She saw other captives in the camp, mostly women and children from various raids, all wearing the same expression of hopeless resignation. Some had been there for months, even years, and had given up all hope of rescue or escape. Sarah learned to survive by keeping her head down and following orders without complaint. But inside, a small flame of determination still burned. She would find a way to escape, to locate her baby, to return to Thomas if he was still alive. The Apache might have crushed her body and imprisoned her soul, but they had not completely broken her spirit. Not yet. 3 months had passed since Sarah's capture, and the Apache camp had moved deeper into the mountains. The air grew cooler as autumn approached, and Sarah found herself grateful for the animal hide blanket she had been given. She had learned a few words of the Apache language, enough to understand basic commands and avoid the worst punishments. But her heart remained heavy with grief and uncertainty about her daughter's fate. The Apache women treated her with a mixture of contempt and indifference. To them, she was simply another captive, a slave to be worked until she was no longer useful. Sarah had witnessed what happened to captives who became too weak or sick to work. They were simply abandoned when the camp moved, left to die alone in the wilderness. This knowledge drove Sarah to push through exhaustion and pain, to prove that she was still valuable enough to keep alive. During her time in the camp, Sarah had observed the Apache way of life with careful attention. She noticed their fierce pride, their deep connection to the land, and their complex social structure. The warriors were treated with great respect, while the women held their own power within the domestic sphere. Children were cherished and given considerable freedom, a fact that made Sarah's heart ache with longing for her own baby. One evening, as Sarah was preparing corn for the evening meal, she heard a sound that made her freeze in place. It was the cry of an infant, high and desperate, coming from one of the nearby shelters. Sarah's hands began to tremble as she recognized something in that cry. Could it be? After 3 months, was her daughter here in this very camp? She wanted to rush toward the sound, but she knew such behavior would only result in punishment. For days afterward, Sarah tried to catch a glimpse of the baby she had heard. She stretched out her tasks, working near different parts of the camp, hoping for another chance to hear that cry. The Apache women grew suspicious of her wandering and beat her for leaving her assigned work area. But Sarah could not give up. The possibility that her daughter might be alive, might be within reach, gave her a renewed sense of purpose. Finally, her persistence was rewarded. While carrying water from the stream one morning, Sarah saw an Apache woman emerge from a shelter with a baby in her arms. The infant was older now, but Sarah recognized her immediately. Those were her daughter's eyes, her daughter's nose, the same tiny fingers that had grasped Sarah's hand on the night of her birth. Sarah dropped the water container and started forward, a cry of joy and anguish escaping her lips. Before she could take more than a few steps, strong hands grabbed her from behind. A warrior had seen her reaction and held her back as she struggled and screamed. The Apache woman with the baby looked at Sarah with cold eyes, then turned and disappeared back into the shelter. Sarah was dragged away and tied to a post in the center of the camp, where she remained for 2 days without food or water as punishment for her outburst. The physical punishment was nothing compared to the emotional torment. Sarah now knew her daughter was alive but living with another woman, being raised as Apache. The baby would never know her real mother, would never know the circumstances of her birth or the family she came from. Sarah's grief threatened to swallow her whole, and for the first time since her capture, she seriously considered giving up entirely. But something unexpected happened during those 2 days tied to the post. An old Apache woman began to visit her, bringing small amounts of water when no one was watching. The woman's face was deeply lined, her hair completely gray, and she moved with the careful deliberation of someone who had lived many years. She spoke no English, but her eyes held something Sarah had not seen from any other Apache: compassion. On the 3rd day, Sarah was released from the post and sent back to work. Her body was weak from the ordeal, but she forced herself to complete every task assigned to her. The old woman continued to show her small kindnesses: an extra portion of food here, a warmer spot to sleep there. Sarah did not understand why this woman was helping her, but she was grateful for any scrap of humanity in her brutal existence. As the weeks passed, Sarah learned more about her situation through careful observation and the few words she had picked up. The Apache woman who had taken her baby was called Desba, and she was the wife of one of the senior warriors in the tribe. Desba had lost her own baby earlier that year and had claimed Sarah's daughter as her own. The baby was now called Nasha, which Sarah learned meant owl. The name felt like another loss, another piece of her daughter being taken away. Sarah discovered that she was not the only white captive in the camp. There was a boy named Jacob who had been taken during a raid 2 years earlier. He was about 12 years old and had adapted so completely to Apache life that he barely remembered his former existence. There was also a Mexican woman named Rosa, who had been captured from a settlement near the border. Rosa spoke a little English, and through her, Sarah learned more about Apache customs and expectations. Rosa explained that captives were sometimes traded or sold to other tribes, to Mexican traders, or even back to white settlements if the price was right. But the longer a captive remained with the Apache, the less likely they were to ever be freed. The Apache grew attached to their captives as property, and parting with valuable workers required significant compensation. Sarah's heart sank as she realized that her chances of escape were diminishing with each passing day. The old woman who had shown Sarah kindness finally revealed her name: Guyen. Through Rosa's translation, Sarah learned that Guyen had once been a captive herself, taken from a different Apache band during a raid many years ago. She had eventually married into the tribe and earned respect through her wisdom and healing skills. Guyen seemed to understand Sarah's pain in a way the others could not, and she became Sarah's only source of comfort in the camp. Winter arrived with brutal cold, and Sarah struggled to adapt to the harsh conditions. The Apache moved to a more sheltered location in a canyon where they would spend the coldest months. Sarah's health deteriorated as the temperature dropped. She developed a persistent cough that left her weak and exhausted. The other women grew impatient with her slower pace of work, and Sarah feared she was becoming one of those captives who would be abandoned when she was no longer useful. Guyen took it upon herself to care for Sarah during this difficult time. She prepared special teas from desert plants, wrapped Sarah in additional hides, and advocated for her with the other women. Sarah did not understand why this old woman cared so much about her fate, but she clung to that kindness like a lifeline. Guyen's care kept Sarah alive through the worst of the winter, when 3 other captives in the camp died from exposure and illness. As Sarah slowly recovered, she noticed increased activity in the camp. Warriors were preparing for something, cleaning weapons and gathering supplies. Through Rosa, Sarah learned that a trading party was coming to the camp. Mexican traders occasionally dealt with the Apache, exchanging goods and sometimes purchasing captives. Sarah's pulse quickened at this news. Could this be her chance for freedom? But Sarah's hopes were complicated by the knowledge that her daughter was also in the camp. If she somehow managed to gain her freedom, would she be forced to leave Nasha behind? Could she live with herself if she abandoned her baby to be raised by strangers? The moral dilemma tore at Sarah's heart, and she spent sleepless nights trying to decide what she would do if the opportunity arose. The trading party arrived on a cold morning in late winter. There were 6 men, a mix of Mexicans and white Americans leading pack horses loaded with goods. They set up a temporary camp just outside the Apache settlement and began negotiations with the tribal leaders. Sarah watched from a distance, her heart pounding with a mixture of hope and dread. The traders set up their display of goods with practiced efficiency. There were rifles, ammunition, blankets, metal cooking pots, knives, and bags of sugar and flour. The Apache warriors examined everything carefully, testing the quality of the weapons and negotiating prices in a mixture of Spanish, English, and Apache. Sarah tried to make herself invisible, unsure whether being noticed by the traders would help or harm her chances. One of the traders, a tall man with a thick beard and weathered face, seemed to be the leader of the group. He spoke Spanish fluently and appeared to have dealt with the Apache before. His eyes swept across the camp, taking in every detail, including the captives who were being kept at a distance from the trading area. When his gaze fell on Sarah, she felt a flicker of hope. Perhaps he could negotiate for her release, but Nguyen had other ideas. The old woman approached Sarah that evening with an urgent expression and pulled her aside. Through a combination of gestures and the few English words Nguyen had learned, she made Sarah understand that she should not try to approach the traders. Nguyen explained that the Apache were unlikely to sell Sarah because she had become a useful worker. Instead, Nguyen suggested a different plan, one that Sarah struggled to understand at first. Nguyen wanted Sarah to appear sickly and weak, to convince the Apache that she was more trouble than she was worth. If the tribe believed Sarah was dying, they might be willing to sell her cheaply rather than waste resources caring for her. It was a risky strategy. If Sarah appeared too sick, the traders might not want to purchase her at all. But Nguyen seemed confident in her plan, and Sarah trusted the old woman who had kept her alive through the winter. For the next 2 days, Sarah followed Nguyen's instructions. She moved slowly, coughed frequently, and barely ate the food provided to her. She made sure the Apache women saw her struggling with even simple tasks. Nguyen supported the deception by shaking her head sadly whenever anyone asked about Sarah's condition, suggesting that the white woman would not survive much longer. The other women began to discuss what to do with Sarah, whether to sell her while she still had some value or simply abandon her. The trading continued for several days. With negotiations over various goods and horses, Sarah learned through Rosa that the traders had also expressed interest in purchasing some of the captives. Jacob, the boy who had been with the Apache for 2 years, was one of those being considered for sale. A Mexican family was reportedly willing to pay well for a strong young worker. Sarah felt sorry for Jacob, who seemed content with his Apache life and showed no desire to return to white society. On the 4th day of trading, Sarah was summoned before the tribal leaders and the head trader. She approached slowly, maintaining her appearance of weakness, though her heart was racing with anxiety. The bearded trader looked her over critically, noting her thin frame and pale complexion. He asked her questions in English, wanting to know her name, where she was from, and how long she had been captive. Sarah answered honestly, her voice barely above a whisper. She told him about the wagon train, about Thomas, and about the baby born just before the attack. The trader's expression softened slightly as she spoke, and he asked if she knew what had happened to her husband and child. Sarah told him about seeing her daughter in the camp, but said nothing about recognizing the baby. She sensed that admitting her daughter was here would complicate any potential sale. The trader turned to the Apache leaders and began negotiating in Spanish. Sarah could only catch a few words, but she understood they were discussing a price. The Apache seemed reluctant to part with her, arguing that she was still capable of work once she recovered. The trader countered that she looked near death and would require significant care and feeding before she would be useful to anyone. Nguyen intervened at this point, speaking rapidly in Apache and gesturing at Sarah with apparent concern. Whatever Nguyen said seemed to have an impact. The Apache leaders conferred among themselves, occasionally glancing at Sarah with calculating expressions. Finally, one of them nodded and stated a price. The trader looked surprised, then pleased. He immediately began counting out payment in the form of ammunition, tobacco, and a fine rifle. Sarah could hardly believe what was happening. She was being sold, her freedom purchased with goods that would help the Apache in their ongoing conflicts. But even as relief flooded through her, Sarah's mind raced with the implications of leaving her daughter behind. She looked desperately at Nguyen, trying to communicate her anguish without words. The old woman met her eyes and gave a barely perceptible shake of her head. There was nothing Sarah could do about the baby now, If she tried to claim her daughter or resist leaving, the sale would be canceled and she would remain a captive forever. The transaction was completed quickly. The trader took possession of Sarah, binding her hands loosely and leading her toward his camp. Sarah looked back at the Apache settlement one last time, her eyes searching for any sign of Nasha. She saw Desba standing outside her shelter, holding the baby, watching the proceedings with a satisfied expression. The sight of her daughter, so close yet completely out of reach, nearly broke Sarah's resolve to remain silent. As they walked away from the Apache camp, the trader surprised Sarah by removing the bindings from her hands. He introduced himself as Miguel Santos, a trader who had been working the frontier for nearly 20 years. He explained that he would take her to Santa Fe, where arrangements could be made to help her return to her family or settle somewhere safe. Sarah thanked him through her tears, overwhelmed by the sudden change in her circumstances. That night, camped with the trading party, Sarah learned more about Miguel and his companions. They were a rough group, hardened by years of dangerous work, but they treated Sarah with basic decency. Miguel shared his food with her and allowed her to sleep near the fire. He asked gentle questions about her ordeal, but did not press when she became too emotional to continue speaking. Sarah told Miguel about Thomas and asked if there was any way to learn what had happened to him. Miguel promised to make inquiries when they reached Santa Fe, where news of wagon train attacks often filtered through. He warned her not to get her hopes up, as many men were killed in such raids, but he would do what he could. Sarah appreciated his honesty, even as it deepened her grief. As the days of travel passed, Sarah's thoughts constantly returned to her daughter. She had gained her freedom, but at what cost? Nasha would grow up as an Apache, never knowing her true heritage or the mother who had given birth to her. The guilt of leaving her behind weighed heavily on Sarah's conscience. She wondered if she should have refused to leave, should have found a way to stay near her daughter even as a captive. Miguel seemed to sense some of Sarah's inner turmoil. One evening, as they sat by the fire, he told her about his own experiences with the Apache. He had seen many captives over the years, and he understood the impossible choices they often faced. He gently suggested that Sarah had done the right thing by accepting her freedom. A captive mother could do little to protect or raise her child, but a free woman might eventually find a way to negotiate for the child's return. The idea had not occurred to Sarah before. Could she somehow earn enough money to purchase her daughter's freedom? Miguel explained that such transactions were rare, but not impossible. If Sarah could save enough resources, if she could find someone willing to negotiate with the Apache, there might be a chance. It was a slim hope, but it was more than Sarah had felt since the moment of her capture. This new possibility gave Sarah the strength to keep moving forward. She began to ask Miguel questions about how such negotiations worked, what it would take to ransom a child from the Apache. Miguel was frank about the difficulties. The Apache valued children highly, especially girls who would grow to help with the tribe's work. It would require a substantial payment, and there was no guarantee the Apache would be willing to sell. But Miguel also shared a piece of information that gave Sarah genuine hope. He knew of another trader, a man with extensive contacts among various Apache bands who occasionally arranged more complex exchanges. This trader, whose name was John Townsend, was known for his ability to negotiate in seemingly impossible situations. Miguel promised to introduce Sarah to Townsend once they reached Santa Fe. As the trading party continued their journey toward Santa Fe, Sarah's health gradually improved. The regular meals, the absence of constant labor and abuse, and the hope of seeing her daughter again all contributed to her recovery. She helped around the camp when she could, trying to show her gratitude to Miguel for purchasing her freedom and treating her with kindness. Sarah also learned more about frontier life from the traders. They told stories of their various dealings, the dangerous encounters they had survived, and the strange situations they had witnessed. Some of their tales were humorous, others tragic, but all of them revealed the complex and often brutal nature of life on the edge of civilization. Sarah began to understand that the world she had entered when she left Missouri was far different from anything she had imagined. Santa Fe emerged from the desert landscape like a mirage. The adobe buildings with their flat roofs and earthen colors blended seamlessly with the surrounding terrain. Sarah had never seen anything like it. The town was a bustling mix of Mexican, American, and native peoples, all conducting business in a chaotic marketplace that seemed to operate in 3 languages simultaneously. The smells of cooking food, animal hides, and dust filled the air as Miguel's trading party made their way through the crowded streets. Miguel brought Sarah to a modest boarding house run by a widow named Mrs. Elena Chavez. The woman took one look at Sarah's gaunt frame and haunted eyes and immediately ushered her inside. Elena spoke broken English but communicated volumes through her compassionate actions. She drew a hot bath for Sarah, the first real bath she had experienced in over 6 months, and provided clean clothes that actually fit properly. Sarah wept as she scrubbed away months of dirt and despair, feeling almost human again for the first time since her capture. Elena's boarding house catered primarily to women in difficult circumstances. There were 2 other former captives staying there, along with several widows and women who had fled bad situations. The atmosphere was one of quiet understanding and mutual support. No one asked invasive questions or demanded explanations. They simply accepted each other and offered help when needed. Sarah found this silent solidarity deeply comforting after months of isolation and cruelty. Miguel visited Sarah the next day with news about Thomas. He had made inquiries at the military fort and among other traders who traveled the routes. The news was not what Sarah had hoped for. The wagon train attack had been devastating. Several men had been killed outright, including the wagon master. Others had been captured along with the women and children. Thomas Mitchell's name appeared on a list of survivors who had made it to a settlement in California. But there was no recent information about his whereabouts. Sarah felt a complicated mixture of relief and uncertainty. Thomas was alive or had been several months ago. But did he think she was dead? Had he searched for her? Was he planning to return east or had he continued west to pursue his dreams of California land? Sarah realized that even if she wanted to find Thomas, she had no resources to make the journey and no guarantee he would still be in the same location. Miguel suggested that Sarah focus on establishing herself in Santa Fe before worrying about reuniting with Thomas. He promised to send word through his network of traders if he learned anything more about her husband's location. In the meantime, Sarah needed to find work and begin saving money if she had any hope of eventually ransoming her daughter. The practical advice was sound, but Sarah's heart ached with the unfairness of it all. Elena helped Sarah find work as a seamstress. Sarah had learned fine needlework from her mother and had always been skilled with detailed handiwork. Several shops in Santa Fe needed women who could do alterations and mending for the town's growing population. The work was not glamorous and the pay was modest, but it was honest employment that allowed Sarah to support herself. She threw herself into the work, finding that the repetitive motions of sewing helped quiet her anxious thoughts. Weeks turned into months, and Sarah slowly built a life in Santa Fe. She saved every penny she could, living frugally and taking on extra work whenever possible. Elena charged her minimal rent, understanding Sarah's goal of saving money for her daughter's ransom. The other women at the boarding house supported her efforts, sometimes bringing her additional sewing projects they had heard about. Sarah was touched by their kindness and slowly began to heal from the trauma of her captivity. Miguel kept his promise and introduced Sarah to John Townsend, the trader with extensive Apache contacts. Townsend was a lean man in his 50s with sharp eyes and a manner that suggested he missed nothing. He listened carefully as Sarah told him about her daughter, asking specific questions about the Apache band that held her and the woman who had claimed the child. When Sarah finished her story, Townsend sat back and considered the situation carefully. The trader was honest about the challenges Sarah faced. Ransoming a child from the Apache was extremely difficult, especially when the child had been adopted by a warrior's wife. The Apache had strict customs about such matters, and Desba would have legal claim to Nasha according to tribal law. However, Townsend did not say it was impossible. He explained that everything depended on finding the right approach and offering something the Apache valued more than one child. Townsend proposed a plan that would take time and significant resources. He would need to make contact with the specific Apache band, establish trust through several trading visits, and gradually work toward negotiating for the child's return. He estimated the process could take anywhere from 6 months to 2 years depending on various factors. The cost would be substantial, requiring not just payment to the Apache but also compensation for Townsend's time and the risks involved. Sarah felt overwhelmed by the scope of what Townsend was describing. The amount of money he mentioned was more than she could save in several years, even with her careful budgeting. She tried not to let despair show on her face, but Townsend seemed to read her thoughts. He told her to take time to consider the matter and to continue saving. Sometimes, he added, unexpected opportunities arose that changed the whole situation. Sarah did not know what he meant by that, but she thanked him for his honesty and promised to keep in touch. The encounter with Townsend reinforced Sarah's determination to work harder and save more. She began taking on additional jobs, doing laundry for wealthy families and helping Elena with the boarding house in exchange for reduced rent. Her days stretched from dawn until late at night, filled with constant labor. But unlike her work as a captive, this labor had purpose and hope behind it. Every dollar she saved brought her one small step closer to her daughter. During this period, Sarah also began attending church services at the local mission. She had not been particularly religious before her ordeal, but she found comfort in the rituals and the community. The priest, Father Mendoza, was a kind man who offered guidance to anyone who sought it. Sarah confided in him about her situation, and he promised to pray for her and her daughter. He also suggested that divine providence might yet provide a path forward that Sarah could not currently see. One evening, nearly a year after her arrival in Santa Fe, Sarah was working late at the seamstress shop when the door opened. She looked up to see a native man enter and her heart nearly stopped. He was Apache. She could tell immediately from his clothing and bearing. For a moment, Sarah was transported back to her captivity, feeling the same fear and helplessness she had experienced in the camp. But this man's expression was calm and peaceful, not threatening. The Apache man approached the counter and, in halting English, explained that he needed clothing repaired. He was part of a delegation that had come to Santa Fe to meet with American officials about territorial boundaries and peace negotiations. Sarah forced herself to remain calm as she took his torn shirt and promised to have it mended by the next day. The man thanked her and left, but Sarah's hand shook as she worked on the repair that evening. The next day, the Apache man returned with 2 others from his delegation. They were all pleased with Sarah's work and asked if she could mend additional items. Sarah agreed, though each interaction with Apache people stirred up painful memories and desperate longings. She studied their faces, listened to their conversations, trying to determine if any of them might be from the band that held her daughter. But these men were from a different group, with different territories and allegiances. Through her interactions with the Apache delegation, Sarah learned something valuable. The various Apache bands were engaging in more frequent negotiations with American and Mexican authorities. The changing political landscape meant that some Apache leaders were seeking ways to coexist peacefully with settlers. This shift created new opportunities for dialogue and exchange. Sarah realized that the timing might actually work in her favor if she could find the right approach. Sarah sought out John Townsend again and told him about the Apache delegation and her observations about the changing political climate. Townsend listened with interest and agreed that these developments could potentially help their cause. He had been monitoring the situation as well and believed that the Apache band holding Sarah's daughter might be more amenable to negotiation than they had been a year earlier. The tribe had suffered losses in recent conflicts and might welcome trade relationships that could benefit them. However, Townsend cautioned Sarah that any approach would still require substantial resources and careful timing. He suggested they wait until after the current peace negotiations concluded, as those talks might create additional opportunities. In the meantime, he would continue gathering information about Desba and her husband through his network of contacts. Sarah agreed to the plan, though waiting was perhaps the hardest thing she had ever done. As another year passed, Sarah continued her work and her saving. She had become a respected member of the Santa Fe community, known for her skill with a needle and her quiet determination. Elena treated her like a daughter, and the other women at the boarding house considered her family. Sarah had built a life for herself, but a piece of her heart remained with the daughter she had barely known. 2 years after her arrival in Santa Fe, Sarah received unexpected news that would change everything. Miguel Santos appeared at the boarding house one afternoon with an urgent expression. He had just returned from a trading expedition and brought information about Desba's husband. The warrior had been killed in a skirmish with Mexican soldiers, leaving Desba a widow with limited support within the tribe. Such circumstances often forced Apache women to make difficult choices about their resources and dependence. John Townsend believed this tragedy, while unfortunate, might create an opening for negotiation. A widow with a child to support would need resources that the tribe might not readily provide. If approached correctly, Desba might be willing to consider trading the child for goods that would ensure her survival and status within the community. It was a delicate situation that required careful handling, but it represented the best opportunity Sarah had encountered. Townsend laid out a detailed plan. He would lead a trading party to the Apache territory, bringing goods specifically chosen to appeal to Desba and the tribal leaders. He would need to make several visits over a period of months, building trust and demonstrating that the trade would benefit everyone involved. Sarah would need to provide a significant portion of the goods, which would cost nearly everything she had saved over the past 2 years. Even then, there were no guarantees. Sarah struggled with the decision for several days. If she invested all her savings and the negotiation failed, she would have nothing left and would need to start over. But if she did not take this chance, another opportunity might not come for years, if ever. By then, her daughter would be older, more integrated into Apache life, and perhaps impossible to reclaim. The risk was enormous, but so was the potential reward. Elena encouraged Sarah to take the chance. The older woman had watched Sarah work tirelessly for 2 years, denying herself every comfort and luxury, all for the sake of a daughter she had held only once. Elena believed that such devotion deserved to be rewarded, and she offered to contribute some of her own savings to help Sarah reach the amount needed. Sarah was moved to tears by the gesture and gratefully accepted the help. Father Mendoza also rallied support from the church community. When word spread about Sarah's situation, several families donated money or goods that could be used in the trade. The seamstress shop owner contributed fabric and finished garments. A wealthy merchant provided ammunition and tools. The outpouring of generosity from people who barely knew Sarah demonstrated the power of her story and the community's desire to see a mother reunited with her child. Within 2 weeks, Townsend had assembled an impressive collection of trade goods. There were rifles, blankets, cooking implements, fabric, beads, tobacco, and other items the Apache valued. The total worth far exceeded what most captive ransoms required, but Townsend insisted that they needed to make an offer too attractive to refuse. He warned Sarah once more that success was not guaranteed, but he promised to do everything in his power to bring her daughter home. Sarah wanted desperately to accompany the trading party, but Townsend firmly refused. Her presence would complicate the negotiations and might trigger memories of conflict within the Apache camp. The traders needed to present this as a straightforward business transaction, not an emotional reunion. Sarah would have to wait in Santa Fe, trusting Townsend to act on her behalf. It was one of the hardest things Sarah had ever agreed to, but she understood the wisdom in his reasoning. The trading party departed on a cool morning in early spring. Sarah watched them leave, feeling as though her heart was riding away with them. The next several weeks were agonizing. She tried to maintain her normal routine, continuing her sewing work and helping Elena at the boarding house. But her mind was constantly in the Apache territory, imagining every possible scenario, praying for a favorable outcome. Elena and the other women provided constant support and distraction. They would not let Sarah sink into despair or obsessive worry. They took her to the market, involved her in cooking elaborate meals, and filled the boarding house with conversation and activity. Their kindness helped Sarah endure the waiting, though nothing could truly ease her anxiety about the outcome of Townsend's mission. 6 weeks after the trading party's departure, a messenger arrived with a brief note from Townsend. The initial contact had been made successfully and negotiations were underway. The Apache leaders were interested in the trade goods, and Desba had agreed to meet with Townsend to discuss terms. It was encouraging news, but Townsend warned that the process might take several more weeks. Sarah clung to the hope contained in that message, reading it repeatedly until the paper grew soft and worn. Another month passed before Townsend returned to Santa Fe. Sarah was working at the seamstress shop when Miguel came, running in to tell her the trading party had been spotted approaching town. Sarah dropped everything and raced toward the edge of town, her heart pounding so hard she could barely breathe. As the riders came into view, Sarah searched desperately for any sign of a small child. Then she saw her, A little girl, perhaps 3 years old, sat in front of one of the riders. She had dark hair that caught the sunlight, and even from a distance Sarah could see Thomas's features in her face mixed with her own. The child looked frightened and confused, clinging to the rider's shirt with small fists. Sarah started running toward them, tears streaming down her face, unable to contain the emotion that had been building for 3 years. But as Sarah reached the trading party, the little girl shrank back in fear. She did not recognize this strange white woman who was crying and reaching for her. The child called out in Apache, clearly asking for Desba, the only mother she remembered. Sarah stopped abruptly, realizing with painful clarity that while she had gotten her daughter back, the girl did not know who she was. Nasha had no memory of Sarah, no connection to the woman who had given birth to her. Townsend dismounted and gently took the child from the other rider. He spoke to her soothingly in Apache, and the girl calmed slightly in his arms. Townsend then turned to Sarah and quietly explained the situation. Desba had agreed to the trade after extensive negotiations, but the parting had been difficult. Nasha had known Desba as her mother for her entire conscious life, and the separation had been traumatic for both of them. The child would need time to adjust to her new circumstances. Sarah nodded through her tears, understanding but heartbroken nonetheless. She had dreamed of this moment for 3 years, imagined her daughter running into her arms with joy and recognition. The reality was far more complicated. She reached out slowly, letting Nasha see her hands, speaking softly in English even though the child could not understand. Townsend carefully transferred the little girl to Sarah's arms, and for the first time in 3 years, Sarah held her daughter. Nasha stiffened and whimpered, clearly wanting to be put down. Sarah fought every instinct to clutch the child tightly and instead held her gently, continuing to speak in a calm, soothing voice. Elena appeared beside them, having followed Sarah from the boarding house. The older woman began speaking to Nasha in Spanish, which seemed to comfort the child slightly. Nasha understood some Spanish from her time with the Apache, who often traded with Mexican peoples. The journey back to the boarding house was slow and careful. Nasha alternated between crying for Desba and sitting in stunned silence. Sarah's heart broke with every tear the child shed, realizing that in gaining her daughter she had caused the little girl pain and confusion. It was not the joyful reunion Sarah had imagined, but it was real and it was happening. Her daughter was alive, free, and in her arms. Everything else would have to be worked out day by day. At the boarding house, Elena had prepared a room for Sarah and Nasha. She had obtained a small bed suitable for a child, and had placed a rag doll on the pillow as a welcoming gift. Nasha was initially wary of everything, but the doll caught her attention. She reached for it tentatively, and Sarah encouraged her to take it. The child clutched the doll to her chest, finding some small comfort in the soft toy. That first night was long and difficult. Nasha cried herself to sleep, calling for Desba and Apache. Sarah sat beside the small bed, gently stroking her daughter's hair, singing lullabies in English that the child did not understand. She wondered if she had made a terrible mistake, if she had been selfish in pursuing this reunion. But as she watched her daughter sleep, seeing Thomas's chin and her own nose in that small face, Sarah knew she would make the same choice again. The next morning brought new challenges. Nasha refused to eat the breakfast Elena prepared, wanting foods she recognized from her Apache life. She cried when Sarah tried to dress her in a simple cotton dress, preferring the leather clothing she was accustomed to. Every interaction required patience and creativity, as Sarah tried to bridge the enormous cultural and linguistic gap between them. Elena proved invaluable during this transition. She knew some Apache words from her years in Santa Fe and could communicate basic concepts to Nasha. She also prepared foods that were closer to what the child knew, using corn and beans in ways familiar to Apache cooking. Gradually, Nasha began to trust Elena and would sometimes allow the older woman to comfort her when she became distressed. Sarah spent every moment trying to connect with her daughter. She learned Apache words from Elena and from books Father Mendoza found at the mission. She incorporated familiar elements into Nasha's new life, while gently introducing American customs. She never forced the child but offered choices and waited patiently for Nasha to come to her voluntarily. It was exhausting, emotionally draining work, but Sarah would not give up. 3 months after Nasha's arrival in Santa Fe, small signs of progress began to emerge. The little girl had stopped crying for Desba every night, though Sarah knew her daughter still thought about the Apache woman who had raised her. Nasha was learning English words, mixing them with Apache and Spanish in a linguistic blend that reflected her complicated heritage. She would sometimes reach for Sarah's hand when frightened, a gesture that made Sarah's heart soar with hope each time it happened. The other women at the boarding house helped tremendously with Nasha's adjustment. They took turns entertaining the child, teaching her games and songs, showing her affection without overwhelming her. Nasha particularly bonded with a young woman named Catherine, who was recovering from her own traumatic experiences. Catherine had infinite patience with the little girl and seemed to understand her confusion and grief in ways others could not. Sarah continued working at the seamstress shop, though she now brought Nasha with her during the day. The shop owner, Mrs. Martinez, welcomed the child and set up a small area where Nasha could play while Sarah sewed. Customers often stopped to speak with the little girl, offering her sweets and compliments. Nasha was gradually learning that this new world, while different from everything she had known, held its own forms of kindness and safety. One afternoon, as Sarah was finishing a dress alteration, Nasha looked up from her play and called out a single word in English, "Mama." Sarah's hands stilled on the fabric, her breath catching in her throat. Nasha had called her Mama before, but always in Apache, a word Sarah had taught her. This was the first time the child had used the English word voluntarily. Sarah looked at her daughter with tears in her eyes and smiled. Nasha smiled back, then returned to playing with her doll as if nothing momentous had just occurred. That evening, Sarah received another piece of life-changing news. Miguel Santos brought word that Thomas Mitchell had been located in Sacramento, California. He had indeed survived the wagon train attack and had eventually made his way to California as originally planned. He had spent months searching for any information about Sarah and their daughter, posting notices and hiring scouts to investigate. When he learned that both had been taken by the Apache and were presumed dead, Thomas had finally given up hope and tried to build a new life. Miguel's contact in California had seen one of Thomas's old notices and had sent word about Sarah's rescue and current location in Santa Fe. According to the message, Thomas was preparing to make the journey to New Mexico immediately. He could arrive within 2 to 3 months depending on weather and trail conditions. Sarah felt a complicated mixture of joy, relief, and anxiety. She wanted to see Thomas again, to be reunited with the man she had married, but she also worried about how he would react to everything that had happened. Sarah also wondered how Nasha would respond to a father she had never known. The little girl had been an infant when Thomas last saw her, and he would be a complete stranger to her now. Sarah hoped that the three of them could somehow become a family, but she knew the path ahead would not be easy. Too much had happened, too much had changed, for them to simply resume their old life together. As the weeks passed, Sarah prepared for Thomas's arrival by telling Nasha about her father. She described him in simple terms the child could understand, showing Nasha the one small sketch of Thomas that Sarah had managed to keep throughout her ordeal. Nasha looked at the picture with curiosity but no recognition. Sarah tried to build positive associations, telling stories about how Thomas had loved Sarah and had wanted so much to have a family with her. Elena helped Sarah prepare the boarding house for Thomas's eventual arrival. They cleaned and organized a room where the family could stay together while deciding their next steps. Elena also worked with Sarah on rebuilding her confidence in being around men again. The trauma of Sarah's captivity had left her wary and uncomfortable around most men, and she needed to overcome that fear before Thomas arrived. Father Mendoza provided spiritual guidance during this transitional period. He counseled Sarah about forgiveness, both of others and of herself. Sarah carried tremendous guilt about the circumstances of Nasha's birth and capture, about the years the child had spent with the Apache, and about the pain Desba must have experienced when Nasha was taken from her. The priest helped Sarah understand that she could not change the past, but she could choose how to move forward with grace and love. 4 months after receiving word about Thomas, Sarah was at the market with Nasha when she heard her name called in a familiar voice. She turned to see Thomas standing at the edge of the plaza, looking older and more weathered than she remembered, but unmistakably her husband. For a moment, they simply stared at each other across the dusty square, processing the miracle of this reunion after so many years of loss and uncertainty. Thomas crossed the distance between them in quick strides, pulling Sarah into an embrace that spoke of all the fear, grief, and hope he had carried since the attack. Sarah clung to him, feeling safe in his arms for the first time in years. Nasha, frightened by this strange man hugging her mother, began to cry and pull at Sarah's skirt. Sarah reluctantly released Thomas and knelt down to comfort her daughter, trying to explain through tears that this man was her father. Thomas looked at his daughter with wonder and heartbreak. He had last seen her as a newborn, and now she was a small child with Apache mannerisms and a mixture of languages. He approached slowly, kneeling beside Sarah and speaking gently to Nasha. The little girl watched him warily but allowed him to remain near. Thomas reached into his pack and pulled out a wooden horse he had carved during his journey, offering it to Nasha with a tentative smile. The child took the toy carefully, examining it with interest. The reunion was emotional and awkward in equal measure. Thomas had built up expectations about finding his wife and daughter that did not match the reality of who they had become. Sarah was no longer the naive young woman who had left Missouri with dreams of California. She was harder, more cautious, marked by experiences that Thomas could barely imagine. Nasha was not the baby he remembered, but a child shaped by a completely different culture and worldview. Over the following weeks, the three of them worked to build connections and establish new patterns. Thomas stayed at the boarding house, giving everyone time to adjust to his presence. He was patient with Nasha, spending hours playing with her and learning a few Apache words to help her feel more comfortable. He listened to Sarah's stories about her captivity and rescue without judgment or blame, though she could see the pain in his eyes as she described what she had endured. Thomas also had his own story to tell. After the attack, he and a handful of other survivors had continued west, driven by necessity rather than choice. They had faced numerous hardships, including starvation, disease, and additional attacks from hostile groups. Thomas had lost everything in the raid except his life, and he had spent the subsequent years working as a laborer in Sacramento, saving money and searching for information about his family. His determination to find them, even after being told they were dead, had kept him going through the darkest times. Sarah learned that Thomas had not remarried or formed new attachments, despite encouragement from friends who insisted he should move on. He had held on to hope longer than was reasonable, and that stubborn faith had finally been rewarded. Sarah felt both grateful for his loyalty and guilty about the years he had spent grieving and searching. She wished she could erase all the pain both of them had experienced, but she was beginning to understand that their suffering had shaped them into people capable of appreciating the precious gift of this reunion. The question of what to do next loomed over them. Thomas still owned a land claim in California that he had been slowly developing. He wanted his family to join him there, to finally pursue the dream that had started this entire journey. But Sarah was hesitant. She had built a life in Santa Fe, developed friendships and community connections that meant something to her. Nasha was just beginning to adjust to her current surroundings, and another major upheaval might be harmful to her fragile sense of stability. They discussed their options carefully, considering what would be best for Nasha and for their family as a whole. Elena encouraged them to make whatever choice felt right, promising that Sarah would always have a home in Santa Fe if she needed one. Father Mendoza reminded them that family was what mattered most, not location or property. Miguel and Townsend offered practical advice about the various regions and opportunities available to them. After much prayer and discussion, Sarah and Thomas decided to stay in Santa Fe for at least another year. This would give Nasha more time to bond with both parents and adjust to her new life. It would allow Thomas to get to know his daughter and his wife again, to rebuild their relationship on a foundation of shared experience rather than memory. They would work together, save money, and make decisions as a family about their future rather than rushing into something that might not be right for all of them. Thomas found work with a freight company that transported goods between Santa Fe and other territories. The job paid reasonably well and kept him close to home. Sarah continued her seamstress work, and together they began to build financial stability. Nasha thrived with both parents present, her personality emerging more fully as she felt secure in their love and commitment to her. She remained a bridge between two worlds, comfortable with both Apache and American ways, fluent in 3 languages before she turned 5 years old. 5 years after Nasha's rescue, the Mitchell family had transformed into something none of them could have predicted when they first set out on that wagon train. Sarah and Thomas had worked tirelessly to create a stable, loving home for their daughter while healing from their own traumas. They had purchased a small house on the outskirts of Santa Fe, with a garden where Sarah grew vegetables and herbs. Thomas had become a respected member of the freight company and had earned enough to invest in a small warehouse business with Miguel Santos. Nasha, now 8 years old, had grown into a remarkable young girl. She attended the mission school, where she excelled in her studies and demonstrated an unusual ability to move between different cultural contexts with ease. She served as a translator when Apache trading parties came to Santa Fe, a role that gave her pride and purpose. Her teachers marveled at her intelligence and adaptability, predicting she would accomplish great things if given the opportunity. Sarah had maintained contact with John Townsend over the years, and through him she occasionally received news about the Apache band that had held her captive. She learned that Desba had remarried and had other children, finding stability and happiness within her community. Sarah was glad to know that the woman who had cared for Nasha during those early years was doing well. She held no bitterness toward Desba, understanding that both of them had been doing their best in impossible circumstances. One spring morning, an unexpected visitor arrived at the Mitchell home. It was Guyan, the old Apache woman who had shown Sarah kindness during her captivity. The woman was even older now, her face more deeply lined, but her eyes still held that same spark of compassion Sarah remembered. Guyan had come to Santa Fe with a peace delegation and had asked specifically to see Sarah. Through an interpreter, she explained that she had wanted to know whether Sarah had survived and whether she had ever found her daughter. Sarah welcomed Guyan into her home with genuine warmth, serving her tea and introducing her to Nasha. The old woman's eyes filled with tears as she looked at the healthy, educated, happy child before her. Through the interpreter, Guyan told Sarah that she had prayed to her gods for this outcome, had hoped that her small acts of kindness might help Sarah survive long enough to reclaim her daughter. She said she was glad her prayers had been answered. Nasha listened to this conversation with intense interest. She had known the basic facts about her early life, but hearing her mother and this Apache elder discuss those events brought them to life in new ways. After the interpreter finished translating, Nasha surprised everyone by speaking directly to Guyan in Apache. The old woman's face broke into a wide smile and she responded enthusiastically. The two conversed for several minutes while Sarah watched with pride and amazement. Guyan told Nasha that she had been a beautiful baby, much loved by everyone in the camp despite the circumstances of her presence there. She said that Desba had cared for her well and that many people had been sad when she left. But Guyan also said she was happy to see Nasha with her birth mother, living a life with opportunities and choices. She blessed Nasha and told her to honor both parts of her heritage, to be proud of her Apache time and her American present. After Guyan left, Sarah and Nasha had a long conversation about identity, belonging, and the complicated nature of family. Nasha asked questions about Desba and about Apache life, questions Sarah answered as honestly as she could. Sarah wanted her daughter to understand that having been loved by multiple mothers was not a betrayal, but a gift. Nasha had been shaped by many hands and many hearts, and that made her stronger and more complete, not divided or confused. Thomas returned home that evening to find Sarah and Nasha looking at the old Apache clothing that Nasha had been wearing when she arrived in Santa Fe. Sarah had kept it carefully preserved, knowing her daughter might want it someday. Nasha tried on the leather dress, now far too small for her, and examined the beadwork with new appreciation. She asked her parents if she could keep it, not to wear but to remember. They agreed, understanding that Nasha needed to honor all parts of her story. The years continued to pass peacefully. Sarah and Thomas had 2 more children, a son and another daughter, giving Nasha siblings who adored her. The family attended church regularly, contributed to the community, and built strong friendships across cultural lines. Sarah never forgot the darkness of her captivity, but she had learned to hold that pain alongside the joy of her present life. She understood that both experiences were real, and that neither negated the other. Sarah also became an advocate for other former captives, helping them adjust to freedom and find resources for healing and rebuilding. She worked with Father Mendoza to establish a support network at the mission, providing practical assistance and emotional support to women who had experienced trauma. Her own story gave her credibility and insight that helped others believe recovery was possible. She transformed her pain into purpose, using her experience to ease the suffering of others. Thomas watched his wife with admiration and love, grateful every day for her strength and resilience. He had initially felt guilty about insisting they make the journey west, blaming himself for everything Sarah and Nasha had endured. But Sarah reminded him regularly that blame served no purpose. They had survived, they had found each other again, and they had built something beautiful from the ruins of their original plans. That was enough, more than enough. Nasha grew into a young woman of extraordinary capability and compassion. She eventually became a teacher at the mission school, using her linguistic abilities and cultural understanding to help bridge divides between different communities. She married a kind man who respected her complicated history and unique perspective. When she had children of her own, she told them stories about both their grandmothers, about Sarah who had given birth to her and Desba who had protected her, about the long journey that brought their family together. Sarah lived to see her grandchildren grow, to watch Nasha become a leader in the community, to enjoy the fruits of all the sacrifices and struggles she had endured. In her later years, sitting in her garden on warm afternoons, Sarah would reflect on the impossible path her life had taken. From the moment of Nasha's birth in that wagon on the desert, through the horror of captivity, to the miracle of rescue and reunion, every step had seemed unbearable at the time. But looking back, Sarah could see the hand of Providence in even the darkest moments. Guyen's unexpected kindness had kept her alive. Miguel's moral character had led him to purchase her freedom rather than leave her to die. Elena's generosity had given her a place to heal and rebuild. Townsend's skill had made Nasha's rescue possible. Thomas's faithfulness had reunited their family. Each person had played a role in a story much larger than themselves. Sarah understood now that she had not been alone, even in her loneliest moments. The compassion of others, the strength of her own determination, and the mysterious workings of fate had all conspired to bring her through fire and emerge transformed but not destroyed. She had learned that the human spirit was more resilient than she had ever imagined, capable of enduring unthinkable hardship and still finding reasons to hope, to love, to continue. The greatest gift, Sarah believed, was not just her own survival or even her reunion with Nasha. It was the wisdom gained through suffering, the empathy born from shared pain, the connections forged in the crucible of adversity. She had started as a naive young woman with simple dreams of a comfortable life. She had become something far more valuable, a woman who understood the complexity of human experience, the importance of mercy, and the redemptive power of love. On Sarah's final days, surrounded by her family and the home she and Thomas had built, she felt at peace with her journey. Nasha held her hand, speaking soft words in English, Spanish, and Apache, honoring all the languages and cultures that had shaped their lives. Sarah looked at her daughter's face, still seeing traces of that tiny infant she had held so briefly before their separation, and felt profound gratitude for the unexpected path that had brought them here. The story that had begun with crushing loss and imprisonment, with fear and desperation, had become a testament to the possibility of redemption. An Apache savior's small kindnesses had planted seeds of hope that eventually flowered into freedom. A trader's moral choice had opened doors to reunion. A community's generosity had made rebuilding possible. And a mother's unwavering determination had brought a daughter home. Sarah's story spread throughout the territory, told and retold by those who knew her. It became a reminder that even in the darkest circumstances, human kindness could light the way forward. That persistence in the face of overwhelming odds could yield miraculous results. That families torn apart by violence and circumstance could be sewn back together with patience, love, and faith. Her legacy lived on in the lives she touched, the captives she helped, the bridges she built between divided communities. Years after Sarah's death, Nasha continued to share her mother's story with new generations. She made sure people understood that survival required not just individual strength, but the compassion of others willing to extend mercy across cultural and racial lines. She honored Guyen's memory alongside Sarah's, recognizing that both women had been essential to her existence. She taught her own children and grandchildren that heritage was complex, that identity could embrace multiple truths simultaneously, and that the most important thing was how you chose to use your experiences to make the world better. The little girl born in a wagon on the desert, captured as an infant, raised as Apache, and rescued to live as an American, had become living proof that the human capacity for adaptation and love was boundless. Her existence bridged worlds that many believed could never be connected. Her life demonstrated that compassion could transcend cultural boundaries, that mothers came in many forms, and that families could be built from the most unlikely materials. She carried within her the wisdom of two peoples, the strength of two mothers, and the hope of all who believed that understanding and mercy could triumph over hatred and division. And that legacy, born from Sarah's suffering and redemption, continued to inspire long after both women had passed from this world into memory and legend.